In 1956, Great Britain made its last attempt to act as an imperial power in the Middle East. The Suez Crisis ended in humiliation, not because Britain lost the military operation, but because Washington called and said, enough. London pulled its troops back. The world understood. The era of British dominance in the region was over. 70 years later, we are witnessing the mirror inversion of that moment. This time Washington calls and says, "Where are you?" And London tries to help, only to discover it barely has enough resources even for a symbolic presence. On March 31st, 2026, UK Defense Secretary John Healey, while visiting the Persian Gulf, announced an expansion of British military deployment. The United Kingdom is sending its most advanced short-range air defense system, Sky Sabre, to Saudi Arabia. A Royal Artillery battery and Sky Sabre operators are set to deploy to Saudi bases this very week. The system includes radars, a command node, and missile launchers capable of intercepting munitions and aircraft. This deployment was confirmed at the exact moment Donald Trump unleashed a wave of criticism against Britain for insufficient action in the Strait of Hormuz. The troops and missile systems are designated for defensive operations against Iranian attacks. The headline sounds simple: more troops to the Middle East. But if we slow down and look at the structure of this decision, we see something far more significant than a defensive measure. This is a moment where several tectonic shifts converge at once. A crisis in the special relationship between London and Washington. The largest energy destabilization since the 1970s, and the exposure of the real, as opposed to declared, military capabilities of a mid-sized European power. Let us take apart each of these layers. Before analyzing the British deployment, we need to understand the battlefield on which it is taking place. The 2026 Iran war began on February 28th, when the United States and Israel launched waves of airstrikes against Iran, including the elimination of Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei and other senior officials. In response, Iran struck back with missiles and drones across the entire Middle East, hitting military and civilian targets in Israel and the Gulf states. The scale of the Iranian response was unprecedented. On the first day alone, strikes hit 10 countries, targeting both military and civilian sites, including hotels in Dubai and Bahrain, and Kuwait's national airport. As of now, Iran has launched more than 3,500 missiles and drones. Here is a detail that deserves far more attention. Before the American-Israeli strikes began, Trump requested permission to use 2 British bases, Diego Garcia and RAF Fairford, as staging platforms for strikes on Iran. Starmer refused. On March 1st, he agreed to make the bases available for defensive operations, but his initial refusal created a rift with Trump. This is not just diplomatic awkwardness. Trump escalated his criticism on March 3rd, telling German Chancellor Merz that he was unhappy with Britain's decision, which forced American planes to fly extra hours. About Starmer, Trump said, "We are not dealing with Winston Churchill." Remember that phrase. It tells us more than it seems. Trump is not referencing a specific person. He is referencing a model of alliance in which the junior partner follows the senior partner without question. A model built in the 1940s. But the world, and critically the very nature of the Anglo-American alliance, has fundamentally changed. Let us slow down and look carefully at what exactly Britain is sending to the region. According to Starmer, speaking before a parliamentary committee on March 23rd, the UK military buildup initially included radar systems, counter-drone systems, F-35 fighters, ground-based air defense, autonomous mine countermeasure vessels, and 400 additional service personnel. 4 additional Typhoon fighters, 3 Wildcat helicopters, and 1 Merlin helicopter were deployed. The Type 45 destroyer HMS Dragon was also dispatched to the region. Now context. Before the conflict began, The Royal Navy had only one ship in the entire Middle East, the mine countermeasure vessel HMS Middleton, based in Bahrain. Not a single major warship was present in the region. Think about that. A power that once controlled the Suez Canal, that maintained naval bases from Aden to Singapore, entered this war with one minesweeper. The Iran war has laid bare the real state of British military capability. The Director of Military Sciences at the Royal United Services Institute, Matthew Mayo, noted that the conflict raises hard questions about the UK's military power and actual defence readiness. The deployment decision has drawn criticism from defence industry experts, some of whom have expressed concern that the UK's long-term needs, such as homeland air defence, will continue to be deferred in favour of current Middle Eastern commitments. This raises a fundamental military question. Can this limited defensive contingent produce a political outcome? The answer is no, and London knows it. The Prime Minister has made clear that Britain will not be drawn into a wider war. The deployment is positioned as part of collective defense of allies, without entanglement in a broader conflict. This is not just caution. This is a new reality. Britain is offering a shield, but categorically refusing to pick up the sword. The question is how sustainable this position can be. The historical analogy is unavoidable. In 1950, at the start of the Korean War, Britain could still send a significant naval group and a brigade. In 1991, during Desert Storm, an armored division. In 2003, in Iraq, 46,000 troops. Now we are talking about a few hundred specialists, a handful of aircraft, and one air defense battery. Each successive war brings a smaller contingent. The curve goes only one way. The slow deployment of HMS Dragon to protect Cyprus has already raised doubts about Britain's military credibility. And while British forces have helped repel Iranian attacks on allies, some Gulf officials have expressed disappointment at how limited that help has been. Now let us scale up and look at the economic architecture of this crisis, because this is where the Iran war becomes everyone's war, through fuel prices, groceries, and mortgage payments. Brent crude prices rose faster than during any other conflict in recent history, breaking past $100 per barrel on March 8, 2026, for the first time in 4 years, and peaking at $126 per barrel. The closure of the strait has been described as the largest energy supply disruption since the 1970s energy crisis, and the largest in the history of the global oil market. Numbers can slip past consciousness. Let us translate them into tangible consequences. The UK has yet to respond to the global energy crisis, during which crude oil prices have risen 60% since the start of American-Israeli strikes on Iran. Energy bills for the average household could rise by £288 per year, according to Ofgem projections. The Bank of England did not cut interest rates in March as expected, citing the consequences of the conflict. Energy bills, mortgage costs, petrol prices, and food prices are all rising. The maritime blockade has triggered a food emergency in Gulf Cooperation Council states, which depend on the strait for over 80% of their calories. By mid-March, 70% of the region's food imports had been disrupted, and consumer prices surged between 40 and 120%. And now, a detail that escapes most commentators. Some vessels did pass through the strait during the conflict, primarily oil tankers headed to China and India. A Pakistani tanker crossed the strait on March 16th with Iranian permission. Iran organized its own shipping channel. One ship paid $2 million for passage. Malaysia reported that Iran permitted its vessels to transit. According to Lloyd's List, payments were accepted by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps in Chinese yuan. This is a structural signal, not bombs and rockets, but the currency of payment. The yuan as the medium of exchange for passage through the world's most critical energy corridor is not a coincidence. It is a precedent. A strait that for centuries operated under the protection of Anglo-American naval hegemony is now, even if temporarily, running by Iranian-Chinese rules. Europe faces rising supply security costs and the risk of diesel shortages in the coming weeks. If the strait remains closed, the world will have to significantly cut oil and gas consumption, but not before prices spike to levels that force consumers and businesses to fly less, drive less, and spend less. At $170 per barrel, the impact on inflation and economic growth roughly doubles, creating a stagflationary shock capable of changing everything from central bank policy to the outcome of U.S. midterm elections. It is in this context that the British deployment must be understood. The Strait of Hormuz is one of the world's most critical energy corridors, and any instability can directly affect fuel prices, supply chains, and the cost of living in the United Kingdom. The chair of the House of Commons Defense Committee, Tanmanjeet Singh Desi, warned that disruption to shipping routes could lead to rising global prices with immediate consequences for British households. When Healy flies to Riyadh with an air defense battery, he is not defending an abstract, rules-based order. He is defending a specific pipeline on which heating bills in Birmingham depend. Let us scale even further. This deployment is not merely a military operation. It is an X-ray of the transatlantic relationship. The once seemingly solid relationship between Britain and the United States has cracked, with President Trump openly clashing with Prime Minister Starmer against the backdrop of the expanding Iran war. The fracture runs through the very essence of the special relationship. Starmer's step, announced on March 16th, signals a historic break. Starmer has aligned himself with a growing European front that includes Germany and Italy, both of which have rejected the conflict as falling outside NATO's remit. German Chancellor Merz was particularly categorical, stating that Berlin would not send warships into a conflict where the United States and Israel did not consult with us before launching strikes. Italy echoed this, with its foreign minister rejecting any maritime missions without a UN or EU mandate. "This is not our war," said the German Defense Ministry. This is not just a mistake. It is a symptom. What we are witnessing is not a temporary disagreement, but a structural crisis of the alliance model built after 1945. A model in which the United States defines the threat and allies follow. Britain is trying to occupy an impossible position, being simultaneously a loyal ally of Washington and an independent actor that will not be dragged into someone else's wars. Starmer has stated, "Much of what is being said and done is designed to make me change my mind. But I am not going to do that. When it comes to the Iran war, we will not be drawn in, because in my assessment, it is not in our country's interest." Meanwhile, Trump publicly mocks this position. Great Britain, our once great ally, perhaps the greatest of them all, is finally seriously thinking about sending 2 aircraft carriers to the Middle East, Trump wrote. "Never mind, Prime Minister Starmer, we no longer need them. But we will remember. We do not need people who join wars after we have already won. We will remember." That is the key phrase here. This is not a social media quip. It is a warning. In Trump's logic, alliance is a transaction, and Britain has not paid the bill. So who benefits from this chaos? China, quietly and methodically. Its ships pass through the strait. Its currency becomes the medium of exchange. Commercial vessels from so-called friendly nations, such as China and Russia, have already received permission to transit the Strait of Hormuz. Russia, as an alternative energy supplier. American officials note that Russia is ramping up exports to fill the gap. India and Pakistan are conducting bilateral diplomacy with Tehran, gaining access to resources that bypass Western mechanisms. The Iranian Strait is becoming not just a geographic feature, but a platform for the formation of an alternative order, not institutional but situational, based on pragmatism rather than rules. If we look at the 5 to 10-year horizon, this crisis could become the Suez moment for the entire Western maritime security system, not because it suffered a military defeat, but because its dependence on a single hegemon was exposed. A hegemon that is no longer willing to bear the costs without direct compensation. Now the final layer, and perhaps the most alarming. Are the institutions working? Downing Street declined to provide a full readout of the phone call between Starmer and Trump, as is standard protocol. This is a small detail, but it speaks volumes. When standard diplomatic transparency breaks down between allies, that is an indicator. Britain maintains that any American aircraft taking off from bases like Fairford and Diego Garcia may operate exclusively in defense of regional allies. However, such a distinction may be unrealistic in an active combat zone. Here, the institutional system of checks and balances faces immense pressure. The UK Parliament receives information in controlled doses. The legal basis of operations is formulated in deliberately vague terms. Defense of allies. The line between defensive and offensive participation in war is blurring. A Financial Times investigation found that $580 million in bets on falling oil prices were placed 15 minutes before the publication of Trump's statement announcing a pause in strikes for negotiations on March 23, 2026. This has raised suspicions of insider trading and demands for an investigation. When war becomes an instrument of real-time market speculation, that is a signal that institutional control over the conflict has weakened. Wars of the past also enriched speculators, but the speed and scale of modern markets create a feedback loop. Financial incentives can influence political decisions, not the other way around. Look at the very structure of the British decision. The deployment is carried out under the framework of collective defense of allies, without entanglement in a wider war. While the Defense Secretary holds detailed discussions about the conflict, the Strait of Hormuz, and further UK cooperation with Gulf states as the war enters its second month. The war enters its second month, and Britain is still discussing and coordinating. This is not leadership. This is reactive crisis management by a middle power that has lost the ability to shape the agenda, but is not yet ready to admit it. Let me end not with a conclusion, but with a question. The British deployment consists of air defense batteries protecting someone else's skies. Fighters flying defensive missions over territories Britain does not control and cannot control. It is the symbolic gesture of a state that wants to remain at the table, but whose chair keeps getting smaller. The Suez Crisis of 1956 took 1 week and reshaped the world order for decades. The Hormuz Crisis of 2026 has already lasted a month, and its consequences may be no smaller in scale. The question I want to leave you with is this. If the largest energy destabilization in history does not produce a new collective security mechanism, if the special relationship functions only as a tool of pressure rather than mutual protection, if middle powers like Britain can only react but never prevent, then who exactly is managing the global order? And is anyone managing it at all? Think about that.